In the far northeast of China, in the region historically known as Manchuria, where winter winds sweep across frozen plains and the cold cuts through the body with brutal force, there existed a place that did not appear on public maps, textbooks, or civilian records. A place hidden behind concrete walls, barbed wire, and armed guards, where one of the darkest systems ever created by human beings was constructed in silence. This place was located in Pingfang District near the city of Harbin in Heilongjiang Province, an area occupied by Imperial Japan after the invasion of Manchuria in 1931, and it began construction in 1932 under the authority of the Imperial Japanese Army. Officially, the compound was described as a water purification and epidemic prevention facility, a medical research center meant to protect public health. But its true identity was Unit 731, a secret biological and chemical warfare research base that would operate from the early 1930s until Japan's defeat in August 1945. From the outside, it appeared to be an ordinary military installation, but inside its massive walls stood laboratories, prison cells, operating theaters, crematoriums, incinerators, testing chambers, and execution sites, all organized with military precision and protected by absolute secrecy. No international inspectors were allowed inside, no humanitarian organizations were permitted access, and no civilian authorities had jurisdiction over its operations. Everything that happened within the compound was controlled directly by the Japanese military. No one entered without authorization, and for those brought in as prisoners, there was only one possible outcome: they would not leave alive. The people taken into Unit 731 were not treated as prisoners or detainees. They were stripped of identity, dignity, and humanity, and were referred to as logs, a term used deliberately by staff to reduce human beings to objects. Men, women, children, elderly civilians, pregnant mothers, and sometimes entire families were seized from villages across northeastern China and other occupied territories, bound, blindfolded, transported in military trucks, and delivered into a system designed not to imprison them, but to use them. Most were Chinese civilians, but others included Koreans, Mongolians, Russians, and captured Allied prisoners of war. No trials were held, no charges were recorded, no families were notified, and no graves were prepared. They vanished into a facility that erased their existence from the outside world.
The architect of this system was Shirō Ishii, a Japanese military doctor and microbiologist born in 1992, who rose rapidly through the ranks of the Imperial Japanese Army's Medical Corps. During the 1920s and early 1930s, Ishii became obsessed with the idea that biological warfare would define the future of military conflict. He believed that disease could be transformed into a weapon more powerful than artillery or bombs, capable of destroying entire populations without conventional battle. He convinced high-ranking military officials in Tokyo that epidemics could be engineered, controlled, and deployed strategically to weaken enemy nations. In return for these promises, the Japanese military granted him unlimited funding, unlimited secrecy, and unrestricted access to human test subjects, giving him the authority to build a system where scientific research and mass murder became inseparable. Inside Unit 731, prisoners were processed like inventory. Their height, weight, age, and physical condition were recorded, and they were assigned numbers instead of names. They were locked in cold concrete cells with iron doors, no windows, no sanitation, and no human contact. Some were kept alive for weeks, others for months, and some for years, not for survival, but for experimentation. Doctors and scientists in white coats moved through the compound calmly,
carrying clipboards, speaking in professional tones, and observing human suffering with clinical detachment. Sympathy was forbidden, and emotional response was considered a failure of discipline. Human beings were deliberately infected with diseases such as plague, cholera, anthrax, typhoid, tuberculosis, and smallpox through injections, contaminated food, infected water, and insect carriers. The goal was not treatment or cure, but observation. Scientists documented symptoms, organ failure, immune response, nerve damage, and the precise progression towards death. Many victims were dissected alive without anesthesia so that organs could be observed functioning in real time. The victims were conscious, aware, and terrified, but their suffering was treated as irrelevant data noise. Their bodies were studied, recorded, and then destroyed. Every death was documented. Every body was disposed of in on-site crematoriums. Ashes were dumped, bones were crushed, and evidence was erased. No graves were marked, no names were preserved, no records were given to families. Outside the compound, the world remained unaware of what was happening because Unit 731 was protected directly by the Imperial Japanese Army and the Japanese government. This was not a rogue operation or an isolated crime. It was a state-funded, state-approved, state-hidden system of scientific mass murder. What began in Pingfang as a secret research facility would soon evolve into something far larger, because the experiments conducted inside these walls were not only about killing individuals, but about learning how to weaponize disease itself. By the mid to late 1930s, the operations inside Unit 731 had evolved into a fully structured system of controlled human experimentation, transforming the Pingfang compound in Harbin, Heilongjiang Province, into a place where suffering was no longer chaotic violence, but organized scientific procedure. Under the leadership of Shirō Ishii and the authority of the Imperial Japanese Army, the facility operated as a closed scientific ecosystem in which human life was treated as laboratory material rather than as human existence. Prisoners were no longer viewed as individuals, but as biological specimens, and every aspect of their physical and psychological condition was reduced to measurable data. The compound itself was divided into specialized zones that reflected the logic of industrial research rather than medicine, including surgical laboratories, disease cultivation units, freezing experiment chambers, chemical testing areas, biological weapon production rooms, and disposal facilities. Each area served a specific function in a larger system whose purpose was to transform the human body into a research tool for military strategy. Inside the surgical laboratories, prisoners were deliberately infected with diseases such as plague, cholera, typhoid, anthrax, tuberculosis, and dysentery, not for treatment, but to study the progression of illness inside the human body. These infections were carried out through injections, contaminated food and water, insect vectors, and airborne exposure. Doctors and researchers carefully observed how symptoms developed, how organs failed, how immune systems collapsed, and how death occurred, documenting every stage in detail. Many of these victims were subjected to vivisection, the practice of cutting open living human beings without anesthesia in order to observe organs functioning in real time. Hearts were watched as they slowed, lungs were examined as they failed, brains were exposed to observe swelling and bleeding, and internal organs were removed while the victims remained conscious. The purpose was not cruelty for its own sake, but data acquisition, because the scientists believed that anesthesia would interfere with biological observation. Pain was considered irrelevant, and suffering was treated as a necessary condition of research. In the freezing chambers, prisoners were exposed to extreme cold as part of experiments designed to study hypothermia and frostbite, conditions Japanese soldiers faced during winter campaigns in northern China and Mongolia. Limbs were submerged in ice water until frozen solid, the skin turning pale white, then gray, then black as tissue died. Guards would strike the frozen limbs with sticks to test rigidity, listening to the sound of frozen flesh cracking. After freezing, various thawing methods were tested, including hot water, open flames, heated air, cold exposure, and amputation. Researchers recorded the speed of tissue death, the spread of gangrene, nerve failure, infection, and decay. These experiments were not conducted to develop treatments for civilians, but to gather data for battlefield survival and military medicine, using civilian prisoners as disposable test subjects. Women and children were not spared from experimentation. Women were deliberately infected with diseases to observe transmission to unborn children. Some were cut open alive so researchers could study fetal infection. Infants were dissected, and children were subjected to disease exposure experiments. Families were sometimes forced to witness the suffering and deaths of relatives, not as punishment, but as part of observation studies on psychological trauma and stress response. Human relationships were treated as variables in experimentation, and emotional suffering became another data category. Every experiment was recorded. Every reaction was documented, every death was logged. Bodies were transported to on-site crematoriums, burned and disposed of without ceremony. Ashes were dumped in unmarked locations, and all physical evidence of identity was destroyed. No death certificates were issued, no names were preserved, no records were given to families. The system was designed not only to kill, but to erase. By the late 1930s, Unit 731 had become more than a research facility. It had become a production center for biological warfare. Bacteria were cultivated in mass quantities, disease strains were refined, and delivery systems were engineered for future deployment. Flea breeding centers were established to produce plague-carrying insects by the millions. Ceramic bombs, aerosol dispersal devices, contaminated food supplies, and infected water containers were developed as weapons. The compound functioned as both a laboratory and a factory, transforming scientific research into military production. This marked a critical transformation in the purpose of Unit 731. The experiments were no longer only about understanding disease, but about turning disease into a weapon. The prisoners were no longer only test subjects, but prototypes for future victims. The data collected inside the Pingfang facility would not remain inside its walls. It would be used to design strategies for mass infection, epidemic warfare, and population destruction. What began as secret experiments had become the foundation of a new form of warfare, one in which death would not arrive through bombs or bullets, but through invisible pathogens that moved through air, water, food, and human contact. Unit 731 now stood as the core of Japan's biological warfare program, protected by military secrecy and state authority, operating beyond law, morality, and accountability. Inside its walls, science had been separated from ethics, medicine from healing, and research from humanity. The compound in Pingfang was no longer simply a place of imprisonment or experimentation. It had become a factory of death, a center for engineered epidemics, and a silent weapon aimed not at soldiers, but at entire populations. By the late 1930s, the secret operations of Unit 731 had begun to move beyond the walls of the Pingfang compound in Harbin, Heilongjiang Province, marking a transformation from hidden laboratory experimentation into active biological warfare. This shift began after the outbreak of the Second Sino-Japanese War on July 7, 1937, following the Marco Polo Bridge incident near Beijing, when the Imperial Japanese Army expanded its occupation across large areas of China. As Japanese forces advanced into new territories, military leadership in Tokyo began to see biological weapons not merely as experimental science, but as strategic military tool capable of destabilizing entire regions without conventional combat. Under the leadership of Shirō Ishii and with direct military authorization, Unit 731 was transformed into the central command structure of a growing biological warfare network that would operate across occupied East Asia between 1937 and 1945. To support this expansion, satellite biological warfare units were established in multiple occupied cities, creating a coordinated system of research, production, and deployment. Unit 1644 was established in Nanjing in Jiangsu Province, Unit 100 in Changchun in Jilin Province, Unit 1855 in Beijing, Unit 8604 in Guangzhou in Guangdong Province, and Unit 9420 in Singapore following Japan's occupation of the city in February 1942. These units operated as extensions of Unit 731, sharing research data, experimental results, and biological production methods. Together, they formed a hidden military infrastructure designed to weaponize disease on a regional scale. This network allowed the Japanese military to conduct experiments not only on individual prisoners, but on entire civilian populations. The first large-scale field tests began in 1939 when Unit 731 initiated biological attacks in rural areas of Zhejiang and Jiangxi provinces. These operations were designed to study how disease spread in real communities rather than controlled laboratory environments. Infected food supplies were introduced into villages, contaminated water sources were created, and biological insects were released into populated areas. These were not accidents or natural outbreaks, but deliberate military operations planned and executed by biological warfare units. The purpose was to measure infection speed, transmission patterns, mortality rates, and social breakdown under epidemic conditions. One of the most documented attacks occurred in October 1940 in Ningbo, Zhejiang Province, where Japanese aircraft dropped ceramic bombs filled with plague-infected fleas over civilian neighborhoods. The fleas spread rapidly through homes, streets, and water systems, causing outbreaks of bubonic plague that killed hundreds of civilians within weeks. In November 1940, similar attacks were carried out in Guizhou and other nearby cities using the same method of aerial dispersal. These operations were designed as real-world experiments to test delivery systems, transmission efficiency, and epidemic control dynamics. Unit 731 scientists monitored the outbreaks closely, collecting data on how quickly disease spread, how medical infrastructure collapsed, and how fear and panic destabilized communities. By 1941, biological warfare had become integrated into Japanese military operations rather than remaining a secret research program. During campaigns in eastern China, wells, rivers, farmland, and food supplies were deliberately contaminated with cholera, plague, and typhoid bacteria. Prisoners from Unit 731 and its satellite facilities were sometimes deliberately infected and released into villages to serve as living carriers of disease, turning human beings into mobile biological weapons. Entire regions became open-air laboratories where civilians were unknowingly transformed into test subjects. At the same time, industrial-scale production of biological agents was taking place at the Pingfang facility. Bacteria were cultivated in large quantities, plague-carrying fleas were bred in mass breeding centers, and weapon delivery systems were engineered for deployment. Ceramic bombs, aerosol dispersal devices, contaminated food containers, and infected water systems were developed as military tools. By 1942, Unit 731 had achieved the logistical capacity to produce biological weapons on a scale sufficient for mass civilian targeting. Disease was no longer just studied, it was manufactured. As World War II expanded across Asia and the Pacific, Japanese military planners began developing biological attack strategies beyond China. Plans were drafted between 1943 and 1945 to deploy biological weapons against Soviet border regions and Allied targets in Southeast Asia. By 1945, Japanese military strategists had even developed plans for biological attacks against the United States using submarines and aircraft, including the proposed Operation Cherry Blossoms at Night, which aimed to deploy plague-infected fleas over American cities. These plans were based directly on data gathered by human experimentation and field testing conducted by Unit 731 and its network. Throughout these operations, civilians remained the primary victims. Villages were destroyed not by bombs but by epidemics. Families were wiped out by invisible pathogens rather than military firepower. Communities collapsed under disease outbreaks they believed were natural disasters, never knowing they were the targets of military experiments. Unit 731 scientists documented these epidemics as successful operations, measuring effectiveness through infection curves, mortality rates, and population displacement, rather than military victory. By the early 1940s, Unit 731 had fully transformed from a hidden research facility into a regional biological warfare command center, directing one of the first systematic programs of epidemic warfare in human history. Disease had been converted into a weapon, science into strategy, and human populations into experimental terrain. What began in Pingfang, a secret laboratory research, had evolved into a silent form of mass destruction, spreading across entire regions, leaving no bomb craters, no battlefields, and no visible front lines, only empty villages, mass graves, and communities erased by invisible war. As Unit 731's biological warfare program expanded across occupied China between 1941 and 1945, the consequences of its operations began to reshape entire regions, not through visible destruction, but through invisible collapse, where death moved silently through air, water, and human contact. Unlike conventional warfare, there were no front lines, no warning sirens, and no armies advancing through streets, only sudden sickness, unexplained outbreaks, and communities that disintegrated from within. In villages across Zhejiang Province, Jiangxi Province, Hunan Province, and other occupied regions, people began dying from diseases they did not understand, believing they were facing natural epidemics, curses, or divine punishment, never knowing they were victims of engineered military attacks. Wells were contaminated, rivers poisoned, farmland infected, and food supplies sabotaged, turning the basic necessities of life into instruments of death. Entire rural populations were exposed without ever seeing a single Japanese soldier. By 1942, epidemic outbreaks caused by Japanese biological operations were being reported across multiple provinces, overwhelming local medical systems that had no knowledge of biological warfare or access to adequate treatments. Doctors and traditional healers were powerless against diseases that spread faster than information. Fear moved faster than understanding. Families abandoned their homes, villages emptied, and refugees carried infection with them as they fled, unknowingly spreading disease into new regions and communities. What began as targeted operations quickly became uncontrollable epidemic chains that devastated civilian populations far beyond the original attack zones. The very nature of biological warfare meant that once released, disease could not be fully controlled, even by those who deployed it. Within Unit 731 and its satellite facilities, this chaos was not seen as tragedy, but as data. Scientists analyzed outbreak patterns, mapping infection routes, transmission speed, mortality ratios, and population collapse. Villages were transformed into statistical models. Human lives became data points. Entire communities were reduced to charts and reports. Japanese military records described outbreaks in clinical language, referring to them as successful dispersal tests and effective transmission operations, measuring success by how quickly disease spread and how many people died, rather than any military objective. Biological warfare had become a science of population destruction. At the same time, the internal operations of Unit 731 and its satellite facilities intensified as the war began to turn against Japan. After major defeats in the Pacific between 1942 and 1944, including the Battle of Midway in June 1942 and the gradual Allied advance across the Pacific, Japanese military leadership became increasingly desperate for unconventional weapons that could shift the balance of power. Biological warfare was viewed as a potential strategic equalizer, capable of inflicting mass casualties without large-scale military engagement. Production inside the Pingfang facility accelerated, bacteria cultivation increased, flea breeding centers expanded, weaponization systems were refined, delivery technologies improved. Unit 731 shifted from experimental research to full-scale military production mode. By 1944, Japanese military planners were developing long-range biological attack strategies beyond Asia. Plans were created to deploy biological agents against Soviet territories along the Manchurian border and against Allied forces in Southeast Asia. Most significantly, in 1945, the Japanese military finalized plans for Operation Cherry Blossoms at Night, a biological attack strategy intended to target the United States. The plan involved using submarines to launch aircraft carrying plague-infected fleas to be released over American cities, including San Diego, California, with the intended date set for September 1945. The operation was designed using data directly gathered from Unit 731's experiments and field deployments in China. The goal was not military engagement, but mass civilian infection, epidemic chaos, and psychological terror. Only Japan's surrender in August 1945, following the atomic bombings of Hiroshima on August 6th and Nagasaki on August 9th, prevented the execution of the plan. As the war neared its end, Unit 731 began destroying evidence of its existence. In August 1945, following Japan's surrender, personnel at the Pingfang facility in Harbin initiated large-scale destruction operations. Buildings were demolished, laboratories burned, documents destroyed, equipment dismantled, and prisoners executed to eliminate witnesses. Survivors were killed to prevent testimony. The compound was partially blown up. Evidence was systematically erased. What had been one of the largest biological warfare facilities in the world was reduced to ruins in a matter of days. However, the end of the war did not bring justice. In the years following 1945, many of Unit 731's leading scientists, including Shirō Ishii, were secretly granted immunity by the United States in exchange for their research data on biological warfare. Their experimental records were transferred to American military intelligence, and in return, they were protected from war crimes prosecution. No international trials were held for Unit 731 personnel. No tribunals were conducted. No global trials like Nuremberg occurred for Japanese biological war crimes. Many of the scientists went on to hold prestigious positions in post-war Japanese medicine, academia, and government. Some became hospital directors, some became university professors, some became public health officials. The victims received no justice. Families received no answers. Communities received no recognition. Entire populations that had been used as experimental material were erased from official history. For decades after the war, Unit 731 remained largely unknown outside East Asia, buried under Cold War politics, classified documents, and political silence. The biological warfare program that had killed tens of thousands of civilians and experimented on countless human beings was hidden from global consciousness. What remained was not just physical destruction, but historical silence. Unit 731 did not disappear because it was defeated. It disappeared because it was hidden. Its legacy lived on in classified files, secret agreements, and suppressed records, leaving behind a reality where one of the greatest crimes in human history was never fully prosecuted, never fully acknowledged, and never fully taught. The victims were denied justice in life and in memory, and the world moved forward without confronting the full scale of what had been done in the name of science and war. In August 1945, as Japan's defeat became inevitable following the atomic bombings of Hiroshima on August 6th and Nagasaki on August 9th, and the formal announcement of surrender on August 15th, the leadership of Unit 731 initiated a systematic campaign to erase the existence of the program. At the Pingfang facility in Harbin, Heilongjiang Province, orders were issued to destroy laboratories, eliminate prisoners, burn documents, dismantle equipment, and remove all physical evidence that could expose the crimes committed inside the compound. Buildings were rigged with explosives, research archives were incinerated, biological materials were destroyed, and surviving prisoners were executed to eliminate witnesses. The compound that had once functioned as one of the largest biological warfare research centers in the world was reduced to ruins in a matter of days. What could not be destroyed was buried, and what could not be buried was abandoned. Unit 731 disappeared not through justice, but through erasure. As Soviet forces advanced into Manchuria in August 1945, during the Soviet invasion of Manchuria, Japanese military personnel fled the region, leaving behind destroyed facilities and abandoned infrastructure. When Soviet troops entered the area around Harbin, they found remnants of laboratories, burned buildings, and evidence of human experimentation, but much of the documentation had already been unichtojeno, and most senior personnel had escaped. Shirō Ishii himself fled, going into hiding to avoid capture and prosecution. The physical structure of Unit 731 had been shattered, but the people who had built it were still alive. In the immediate post-war years, the world focused on rebuilding and on the prosecution of Nazi war crimes in Europe through the Nuremberg trials beginning in November 1945. In Asia, the International Military Tribunal for the Far East, also known as the Tokyo Trials, began in May 1946 to prosecute Japanese leaders for war crimes. However, Unit 731 was largely absent from these proceedings. Its crimes were not publicly presented in full, its victims were not represented, its experiments were not exposed to the world in the way Nazi medical crimes were. Behind the scenes, a different process was taking place. The United States, now entering the Cold War era and seeking strategic advantage over the Soviet Union, recognized the value of Unit 731's research data. The biological warfare experiments conducted by Shirō Ishii and his team represented years of human experimentation data that no Western nation possessed. Rather than prosecuting the scientists responsible, the U.S. military intelligence negotiated secret agreements with Unit 731 personnel. In exchange for full access to their biological warfare research, data, and experimental findings, the United States granted immunity from war crimes prosecution to Ishii and many of his associates. By the late 1940s, this agreement had been finalized in secrecy. Shirō Ishii was never tried. He was never imprisoned. He was never publicly prosecuted. Many of Unit 731's senior scientists were protected from legal consequences. Their data was transferred into American military research archives. Their crimes were classified. Their identities were shielded. The victims were never informed. The families were never compensated. The history was buried under military secrecy. As a result, many of the men who had conducted human experiments went on to live normal lives in post-war Japan. Some became hospital directors. Some became university professors. Some became medical researchers. Some entered government health institutions. Some worked in pharmaceutical companies. They reintegrated into society without accountability, without punishment, and without public exposure. The system that had allowed Unit 731 to exist was never dismantled through justice, only through political convenience. At the same time, the victims of Unit 731 were erased from official records. There were no mass memorials, no national apologies, no international tribunals, no global recognition. Entire villages that had been destroyed by biological attacks were left without historical documentation. Families who lost relatives never received explanations. Survivors carried trauma without recognition. Communities that had been used as experimental zones were never acknowledged as victims of war crimes. For decades, Unit 731 remained largely unknown outside China, Korea, and parts of Russia. Cold War politics, classified archives, and political silence ensured that its history did not enter mainstream global education. Western textbooks focused on Nazi crimes, while Japanese biological warfare remained buried. The story of Unit 731 became one of the most successfully hidden war crimes programs in modern history, not because it lacked evidence, but because powerful governments chose silence over justice. The destruction of the Pingfang facility did not end Unit 731's legacy. It transformed it into something more dangerous, a crime without accountability, a massacre without prosecution, and a genocide without global recognition. What had been erased physically remained alive in classified files, hidden agreements, and suppressed archives. The silence that followed the war was not accidental. It was engineered, negotiated, and maintained. Unit 731 did not disappear because it was defeated. It disappeared because it was protected. Its scientists were not judged by the world. They were absorbed into it. Its crimes were not taught. They were hidden. Its victims were not honored. They were forgotten. And history moved forward without ever fully confronting one of the most systematic programs of human experimentation and biological warfare ever created. In the decades following World War II, the silence surrounding Unit 731 became almost as powerful as the crimes themselves. From 1945 through the Cold War era, its history remained fragmented, suppressed, and politically inconvenient, buried beneath diplomatic interests, classified military archives, and international power struggles. While Europe confronted the legacy of Nazi war crimes through trials, memorials, museums, and education systems, the atrocities committed by Japan's biological warfare program remained largely excluded from global historical consciousness. Unit 731 became a crime without a courtroom, a genocide without a tribunal, and a massacre without a memorial. In China, survivors and affected communities carried memories that had no official recognition. Villages that had been devastated by biological attacks in Jiangxi, Jiangxi, and other provinces were left with trauma but no justice. Families who had lost children, parents, and entire bloodlines to engineered epidemics were never informed of the truth. Local oral histories preserved fragments of memory, but there was no national or international platform to amplify their voices. Fear, censorship, and political instability prevented open discussion for decades. In Japan, post-war society moved rapidly toward reconstruction and modernization. The narrative of victimhood focused heavily on the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, while Japanese war crimes in Asia were marginalized or minimized in public discourse. Unit 731 was rarely mentioned in school curricula. Official government acknowledgement remained limited and indirect. The scientists who had participated in the program lived normal lives, integrated into society, protected by silence and institutional denial. It was not until the 1980s and 1990s that broader public awareness of Unit 731 began to emerge. Chinese historians, survivors, and investigative journalists started publishing testimonies, documents, and survivor accounts. Former Japanese personnel began to speak publicly, some confessing their roles in experiments and biological warfare operations. Academic research slowly uncovered fragments of the truth. Museums began to appear, including the Unit 731 Museum in Harbin, established on the site of the former Pingfang compound, where ruins of the facility still remain as physical evidence of what once existed there. By the early 1950s, the physical remnants of Unit 731 had largely faded into ruins, but its influence had not disappeared. Instead, it had migrated into hidden institutions, classified research programs, and silent political agreements that reshaped post-war power structures. The end of World War II did not mark the end of biological warfare research. It marked its transformation. Knowledge extracted through human suffering did not vanish with the destruction of the Pingfang facility in August 1945. It was absorbed into new military systems under different flags and different governments. What changed was not the science, but the visibility of it. The United States, now locked in geopolitical rivalry with the Soviet Union, entered the Cold War era with a strategic obsession over weapons of mass destruction. Nuclear weapons, chemical weapons, and biological weapons became central to military planning. In this environment, the research data obtained from Unit 731 became a classified asset rather than evidence of crime. Experimental records that had been produced through vivisection, infection, and human testing were transferred into U.S. military research archives and biological warfare programs. This data contributed to the development of Cold War biological research initiatives in facilities such as Fort Detrick, Maryland, which became the center of American biological warfare research during the late 1940s and 1950s. The crimes were not erased, they were repurposed. This marked a disturbing continuity rather than a rupture in history. The logic that justified Unit 731 did not disappear, it simply changed uniforms. The belief that scientific progress could override ethical boundaries continued under new political systems. The idea that human suffering could be transformed into strategic advantage remained intact. Biological warfare research did not stop in 1945. It expanded under the logic of deterrence, defense, and national security. Meanwhile, in East Asia, the geopolitical map was being redrawn. China entered civil war between the Chinese Communist Party and the nationalist government, culminating in the establishment of the People's Republic of China in 1949. Japan became a U.S. ally in the Cold War system. Political alliances reshaped historical accountability. War crimes that threatened diplomatic relations were suppressed. Truth became negotiable. Memory became political. In Japan, the post-war Reconstruction period focused on economic growth, modernization, and national recovery. There was little political will to confront crimes that could destabilize social cohesion or international relations. Unit 731 remained absent from official narratives, educational systems, and public discourse. Silence was institutionalized. Denial became normalized. Generations grew up without learning that their country had operated one of the most extensive biological warfare programs in human history.